Welcome back, everyone, to the Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at geopolitics, economics, international relations, and right now the conflict over Iran. We've seen the peace talks largely collapse. JD Vance, the vice president, was in Pakistan meeting chief negotiators of the Iranian side, and for a marathon of 21 hours, and nothing really happened. They largely collapsed. And so Trump, in his infinite wisdom, has decided to impose a naval blockade starting essentially now, and will involve the impediment of any and all vessels trying to traverse the strait. And well, needless to say, things are moving quite quickly. And I needed someone who is far more knowledgeable than me to help make sense of it all. And that's why I'm delighted to reintroduce Ross Harrison, who's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. And we had on, I think it was almost 2 weeks ago now, Ross. Now it's Sunday. You're very kind to join the program on the weekend. And I mean, take a step back. Did you really think that the talks were going to lead anywhere?
Well, remember, Peter, that war is really a negotiation of its own form, in its own form. You know, Karl von Clausewitz said that war is a continuation of politics by other means. So this whole endeavor, in a way, is a negotiation of who has the upper hand in terms of power. Did I expect the negotiations in Islamabad to actually lead to some kind of a final settlement on all of the outstanding issues? No, I did not. I thought it was significant, and it was the highest level engagement between the United States and Iran since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So it was significant that Vice President Vance was there. But remember, the negotiations that have taken place before between the United States and Iran, the main one being the JCPOA that was negotiated in 2015, which was US and Iran plus all the other permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. That took several years to negotiate, and that was only on the nuclear file. They had decided to compartmentalize the issues, excuse me, and focus only on the nuclear issue. And that took months after month after month of intense negotiations round the clock for several years to arrive at a final settlement in 2015. So the notion that somehow meeting for 21 hours in Islamabad, or even 48 hours if it had been extended, that would lead to some kind of a final solution on the full array of issues that faced the US and Iran, that was an unrealistic expectation. One expectation that could have been perhaps bought into would have been that they would have at least covered a set of principles, or agreed upon a set of principles for further negotiation. That may or may not have happened in private. We don't know that. We do know that the negotiations ended peremptorily when JD Vance, vice president, walked out of the talks and said that they're over for now. But I think it's also important that nobody said that there would be no further rounds of negotiations, that there will be no more negotiations. Yes, Donald Trump actually put a cap on it by saying he's going to institute a full blockade. We don't know how that's going to work out, and whether that's actually part of the grandstanding as well, whether that's part of the negotiation process. So it's unclear at this point. But I did not expect them to lead to a final settlement, but I also expected them to, at least at the end, to have acknowledged progress. And that does not seem to be the case. But what gets decided in public and what gets decided in private can be two different things in these kinds of negotiations.
Well, from my experience of being in the room in a multilateral sense, the UN or whatever, there's a lot of movement that happens behind the scenes that we have no idea. We're never privy to. And I think that's why when people criticize the UN, yes, it's very limited in what it can do. But I think people don't fully appreciate what really is part of diplomacy at the highest level of governance across so many different countries and interests and so on. And therefore take that and put it in the high intensity urgency setting that we're seeing with the United States and Iran. I mean, from my experience, these two have been conducting backdoor diplomacy for years. and we've barely known about it, or the Omanis will be running between room to room. So in your mind, how much backdoor diplomacy could still be going on even whilst we see escalations over the Strait of Hormuz happen?
Well, I think if you look at the teams that the U.S. brought to the negotiation, or the team that the U.S. brought to the negotiation, and compare that to the Iranian team, the Iranian team, I think, came with a wide array of expertise on nuclear issues, on issues related to the United States. It was the Speaker of the Majlis or Parliament, Ghalibaf. It was the Foreign Minister Agashi, and a full array of advisors as well,
Right.
that were ready for backroom negotiations, as you asked the question. The U.S., to my knowledge, brought basically the vice president and the former interlocutors or negotiators in previous rounds, which was president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has no government portfolio, and Steve Witkoff, who has been part of a number of different negotiations. None of them have been very successful, frankly, with Ukraine or with Gaza. So I don't think they came prepared for backroom negotiations. And it's not clear to me, Peter, whether they are even tapping into the expertise that at least used to live in Washington, in the IC, the intelligence community, in the State Department, in the Defense Department, and in the National Security Council about Iranian affairs. So normally what you would see in backroom negotiations, you would see consultation with advisors, you would see expertise being brought to bear, you would have subject matter experts on issues related to the nuclear file or Iran's missile program, and that would lend the kind of expertise required to advance an agenda as complex as this one. So it does not seem likely that I'm sure there's probably back channel conversations involving the Chinese and the Pakistanis and maybe even the Europeans in Washington. But whether that leads to an intense backroom negotiation, we don't know. I think the other thing to keep in mind, Peter, because you mentioned, involvement in other multilateral negotiations, this one is intrinsically complex. Because what the Iranians did in the first days of the war is they basically expanded the war and the escalation horizontally, bringing in the Hezbollah, bringing in the Hashd Shabi, what we call the PMUs in Iraq, to some degree later on, in a more limited fashion, the Houthis, and then they brought in the Gulf Arab states, not because the Gulf Arab states were part of this conflict initially, but Iran started targeting the Gulf Arab states in order to put pressure on the United States, and then finally the Strait of Hormuz. So they created a 3 or 4D chessboard, and any kind of diplomacy that's going to lead to a final de-escalation has to deal with all of these interconnected but related but separate issues, and that makes it increasingly complex and requires more time, frankly, than the United States put on this ceasefire, and it requires more expertise across the board. It's not clear to me whether the U.S. is really committed to a process by which they can untangle these issues and lead to some kind of final cessation of hostilities, or whether this is just an interlude to a next phase of a conflict, as you implied in your introduction.
So on that point, are we basically saying that the Americans are approaching this in bad faith? That they don't really want to have talks, and the Iranians are actually more inclined to try to find some kind of drawdown of
Yeah, Peter, it's a good question. I mean, I think the United States, I don't think Donald Trump wants to go back to a kinetic war in the way that it was waged in the lead up to the ceasefire. I think he wants to find a way out. But I think I don't think they have learned the lesson that if you want to negotiate with the Iranians, coming in with ultimatums, and particularly an ultimatum of zero enrichment, which has always been a red line for the Iranians, coming in basically dictating to the Iranians what the terms will be, which is tantamount for them to surrender, is just not going to work. So whether it's bad faith or bad information or being poorly advised or just being, frankly, having the hubris that military power, raw military power, translates into political power and will lead to an ultimate capitulation and submission, I honestly don't know. It's as I've said before when I was in Doha, I said I have a much easier time decoding Iran's foreign policy. I wrote a book called Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. A much easier time decoding them than I do my own government. So it's hard to know whether it's bad faith or just bad strategy.
How much is this to do with the concept of anchoring, in your opinion, Ross? Because there's been this idea, this argument, this interpretation that Trump deliberately starts with a very extreme set of threats or an extreme sort of set of ideas. Take the Overton window as another example, right? So you have an extreme thing that people would usually think was outrageous, radical. So you therefore tried to bring people on board by suggesting something less extreme, which then increasingly normalizes the more radical one. Gay marriage is the best example I can think of. You know, people were opposed to gay marriage, so you start off with something like a civil union because it becomes, and then over time, gay marriage was more accepted in society. So is Trump effectively coming out with the most outrageous statements and threats as a way to then offer something not as extreme, and therefore it's more likely people will accept it?
Well, that approach can work, provided there are certain bounds.
Right.
And I think what Donald Trump did on Easter Day, which is not just bluster, but was a threat of genocide, basically erasing, basically committing a war crime if he would implement it. Maybe even stating it was a war crime. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. Saying that we're going to obliterate the power plants and the bridges. And then the next day or day two later, basically threatening civilizational erasure. That basically undermines the United States and the role that the United States has played in the world. So somehow the notion that he could just dial that back and then lead to a ceasefire and then normalize more abnormal behavior because it's not as extreme as the most extreme. I don't think so, Peter. I mean, I understand the logic there, but I think that is so far past the realm of just not even civility, just in terms of humanity, frankly, and crashes through and breaks through all the international norms that the United States helped establish after the Second World War. That I don't think that it normalizes lesser behavior. I think it just calls into question, frankly, the civility, the integrity, and the strategy of the United States. So in lesser form, the answer is yes, of course. That's how bargaining theory does that. You can set up a situation where you go for an extreme kind of concession, and then you kind of dial it back, and those kinds of things are done all the time. But this, I don't think that this. I think if we basically assume that this was part of a strategy on part of Donald Trump, I think we misread the moment, and that is that this is not normal, and it's not considered normal by most Americans, I wouldn't think, and certainly not by the international community, by our allies and by our adversaries. And I think it will be exploited. In the end of the day, this is going to weaken the result, not the resolve of the United States, it's going to weaken the already damaged reputation the United States had. So no, I understand the logic, but I don't buy it at this point.
No, I mean, it's in my opinion, Ross, I think that it's hard to believe that Trump is playing 4D chess, or what people say now is 5D chess, because 4D chess was so 2025. I just find it hard to believe when the guy is swearing and losing his marbles on Twitter. That just doesn't strike me as someone who's in control of the situation. But you talk about the United States and the ability for it to retain some degree of international law. Hasn't that ship sailed? Don't we think international law is largely irrelevant? Mighty right is back, and whether or not, I would prefer multilateralism, the idea of the UN, and all these sorts of things. But are we?
Yeah.
Should we not kid ourselves anymore?
Yeah, I will address that. Let me go back to your point about the 3, 4, or 5D chessboard. In many ways, I think as difficult as the Islamic Republic has been as a government, both to its own people and to the region and the international community, if anybody's playing 3 or 4D chess right now, it's the Iranians, because they have set the table. Listen, the United States and Israel set the terms of how this war started. Right, when they were going to launch the war, what they were going to do first. They attacked this. They attacked the supreme leader, the top layer of leadership in Iran, decimating it. But since that time, the Iranians have shaped the battlefield in many ways. They don't have the kinetic power. They don't have the military power. They can't compete with the United States that way. But what they did was, in a way, they play 3 or 4D chess by making it very, very difficult for the United States to deal with all the contingencies that it had to deal with. It was very clear it couldn't protect our Gulf Arab allies. It was very clear it lacked a clear, effective way to open the Strait of Hormuz, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about today in terms of the blockade. And it made it very, very difficult for the United States to claim a victory, given the potential economic damage it was doing to the United States and doing to the global community. So I think if anybody was playing 3D chess or 4D chess, I think it was probably the Iranians. Now, how they deal with that and if you're doing 3 or 4D chess on the military or quasi-military side of things, you have to do the same thing in reverse when you're doing diplomacy, and how that gets unraveled is kind of the conundrum we're in today. I think in terms of international law and whether that ship has sailed, Peter, yeah, I mean, I guess I have to remain at least maybe a scintilla of hope out there. I think in terms of the United States being a guarantor of international law and of international norms for the foreseeable future, that ship has sailed. I think there are other stakeholders out there who have an interest in not necessarily preserving international law the way we have conceived it, but I would just say, let me just take the law piece out, because that might have sailed. But I think international order, I think most other stakeholders out there, including China, by the way, and we saw the Chinese involved with the Pakistanis behind the scenes in terms of the setting up a diplomatic channel. We have the Europeans, which have not proven particularly effective, but right now we're not giving them much choice, but perhaps to be more effective over time. I think there are folks who want to preserve at least an international order. It may not be a US-led international order. It probably won't necessarily be a Chinese-led international order, but some form of stability so that the whole system doesn't collapse before either the United States resurrects itself at some future point in time, which I'm skeptical of, or there's another actor that takes a leadership role, or there is no leader. It's just an agreed upon set of norms that the international community follows, even though the United States has not been following it. So yeah, I think in some ways the ship has sailed, but I don't think, given the interconnectivity of the globe, I think there will be other stakeholders out there that at least will try to preserve a semblance or a modicum of stability and order in the international system, whether it's the United States or other, maybe in concert with the United States, but I don't think the United States as the leader of that international order or the norms, as you mentioned, international law. I think that ship has sailed, certainly for my lifetime, and hope maybe even your lifetime.
Oh wow, there's a lot there that I'd love to break down, but I have to try and keep us on a certain trajectory. I want to ask you a little bit more about this counterproduction of closing the strait, but just, I mean, look, I'm curious what audience members, people listening, also think. If they drop their comments, what they think is international law dead. But yeah, I mean, China, to me, it depends. Does China want to be a global hegemon? Does it just want to have more of a balanced quasi sort of leadership with the US, status quo power? These are all concepts that I think are argued about between academics and theorists. But on the point about Trump and the closure, then, the argument I've been seeing on X by some people, or at least very pro-Trump, is that this is all part of some grand strategy, that because Iran wasn't able to close the strait, Trump knew that, and so he's decided to he would humor the talks, but because they weren't going to go anywhere, now he's going to close the strait, blockade everything trying to get through, and force the hand of the Iranians, which doesn't strike me as really that realistic. Because, I mean, how much power is this going to require from the United States? Is it sustainable? The Brits seem to be tempted to join in. We've got a demining coalition which seems to be emerging. I don't know. Where do you think that this goes in Trump's brain? What is the strategy here?
I can't comment on Trump's brain. That's a place I don't want to live. I don't want to live within, frankly. That's a dangerous place. But I think, I'm not sure, Peter, is the honest answer here, because it's too early. We don't really know what this is going to look like in terms of other stakeholders that may come with the United States here. Listen, I don't think it's hard to imagine European powers coming with the United States at this point in time to blockade the strait, which is an act of war. And it will likely be challenged. It might be challenged diplomatically by the Chinese and by other folks. You know, if you think about it, Iran has something to lose through the blockade of the strait, but they've already gotten a number of ships through, more than almost any other country since the start of the war already. And they were selectively bringing ships through based upon some kind of political criteria of whether they supported the United States and Israel in this war or not. By completely closing the strait, it becomes an active war zone. It's hard for me to picture European countries who are, I think, do have a sense of the day after, or at least a vision of the day after, even if Donald Trump does not. It's hard for me to imagine them coming with the United States into this endeavor, very, very risky endeavor. I can see them at the cessation of hostilities, perhaps coming in and helping politically and economically, working with Gulf Arab states and with the United States. That I can envision. It's hard for me to imagine, and I don't speak for Great Britain. I don't speak for anybody other than myself at this point. But I think it's hard for me to imagine that they have resisted up to this point joining the United States for several reasons. One is that they have been attacked. The NATO alliance itself has been attacked by the United States in a lead up to this war and during the war. Donald Trump has tried to bully NATO members. Number one, and number two, I think they were smart in the sense that this was not a war that they started, and it's not a war that they necessarily think was a legitimate war. And so for them to come in at this stage two, basically puts them as hostages to the U.S. agenda. And so I don't necessarily see that happening. It's hard to know where this plays out. I mean, Trump apparently has a summit coming up in middle of May, just in a couple of weeks in Beijing. Will he delay that again? I mean, the Chinese, are they going to meet with him if he's blockading Chinese oil coming through? It's really hard to say. And you may need a maritime specialist to help you through some of these issues.
Well, no, you've alluded to the point, which is for viewers, we're going to have some deeper dives with some specific experts from a maritime perspective, because I think it's worth it. I mean, I'll be in next week meeting a couple of interesting individuals at an event in New York, Ambassador John Bolton, actually. So I'm interested to hear what he has to say.
Good luck.
Yeah, I'm interested to know what he has to say about this latest foreign policy decision by Trump. But just, again, to twist this around a little bit, and then I promise we'll move out from Trump's mental thinking, or their lack of, which is simply his emphasis was, okay, forget it. I'm not going to bother with a straight up home move. It's your problem, Europe. It's your problem, everyone else. And now, because of the talks, he is literally committing so many assets to this strait. And as we've seen historically, be that the British in the First World War, or the Napoleon and stuff, naval blockades have a very ineffective, inefficient track record. They're very hard to sustain, and especially in somewhere as volatile as this part of the world. How long could this realistically go on for? And what would the Iranians be doing from their perspective? Like, continuing to negotiate, just start striking again? I don't know where this goes.
It's not clear. I mean, I think the question becomes whether this is perceived as being performative by the Iranians. In other words, they put ships there, some get through, some don't get through, and whether it's part of a negotiation strategy that they don't necessarily want to undermine, or whether they see this as really what Donald Trump threatens, which is this is basically trying to bring Iran to its knees and getting Iran to capitulate on not just opening up the strait, but on all the other matters in terms of nuclear enrichment and so forth. If the Iranians see it as capitulation, see it as an attempt to exercise raw military power, they're going to do what they do best, which is figure a way to sabotage it using some kind of guerrilla tactics, using some kind of asymmetric means. I think what's striking, Peter, about this is, any kind of military action, whether it be a blockade, whether it be a raid, whether it be an attack, has to be hitched, as I mentioned earlier in this podcast,
Mhm.
some kind of clearly stated, or at least clearly understood, at least by those that are waging it, if not by the general public, political objective here. And it seems to me that this is basically just a struggle of wills, that what Donald Trump wants to do is not really negotiate, and not show any weakness and not show any give and take, but wants the Iranians to submit and basically to surrender. And if that is his goal, I mean, if his goal is opening the Strait of Hormuz and negotiating on the nuclear file, he probably could do that on the negotiating table, at the negotiating table. These issues are resolvable, difficult, but are resolvable. He could do that at the negotiating table. Donald Trump tends to use military means to achieve things that he could have achieved at the negotiating table or had already been achieved at the negotiating table. And he uses military means and sets Iran for sure, but sets the United States further back in terms of achieving those objectives. So if his goal is, we don't know what his goal is, but if his goal is to get the Iranians to open the strait and fully capitulate, it's just not going to work. Unless the US has a clear escalation plan to go in there further, put boots on the ground in larger numbers than I think the US has committed for, and actually change the political calculus in Tehran. And to me, these tactics just don't seem to work. Now, if it's used to strengthen the US hand a bit in a next round of negotiation, that's possible. I think it's misguided, but that's possible. But I don't really know where it goes from here. And I think to some degree, Peter, I think we have to recognize that the parties that are going to be hurt the most in this are probably our allies, the Gulf Arab allies. I mean, they'll try to figure out a way to alternative pipelines and so forth through the Red Sea, but then the Houthis could, something we haven't talked about, could try to mine and undermine the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, and close that route off, which creates a whole other set of complexities for the United States. It creates complexities for our European partners. It can create complexities for China at a time we're trying to meet with China. The Pakistanis are affected by it. It will affect Iran, but only longer term, and it'll affect the United States quickly, not because it needs the energy that comes out of there, but because it's going to create economic havoc and potentially lead to a further spike in the price of oil. So it seems to me that this isn't just trying to get Iran to capitulate. It's actually a form of some kind of a self-inflicted. There's an approach in strategy, sort of a jujitsu approach, where you try to get your opponent to use its own weight against itself. Right? That was something Al Qaeda used at 9/11. They knew that I know we're going off topic, but I'll give it as an example.
No, it's
They knew that the United States was going to come into Afghanistan. That they knew. And they believed that the only way for the United States to be weakened, they miscalculated to some degree, was to draw the United States in. And that the United States would be bloodied and spend significant human and financial capital there to weaken the United States. Well, in a way, if you think about what Iran has been doing here, and I'm not comparing Iran to Al Qaeda, I'm just using the historical examples as comparison. If you think about what Iran has done with the Strait of Hormuz, if in fact they envision a blockade, it could be a move that actually hurts the United States to a greater degree in some ways than it hurts Iran. Now, the danger here, Peter, is in any kind of military endeavor, you have to, or you should, have a way out, a way to de-escalate. It's not clear to me if this fails, if the blockade fails to create submission on the part of the Iranians, where the United States goes from here. That's the danger. How much further do we escalate, or is there a political path where the United States could de-escalate? The more Donald Trump escalates and creates complexity, the harder it is for him to step back. And that's the danger.
Well, a lot of this obviously relates to the escalation ladder, things like deterrence theory, but also something that maybe you would agree with is some people argue the Iranians or the IRGC like to use managed escalation. And I think it relates to what you were just saying, that the Iranians have a very clear, like they try to push the limits of things as much as they can without directly engaging the United States. That's all the concept of plausible deniability and why they levied proxies. And you ruined my opportunity to bring in the Houthis and sound like a really knowledgeable guy by saying, well, what about the other Gulf of Aden and closing that? Because in my mind, if we run that scenario for a second, if they do activate the Houthis, and they start putting pressure on the Gulf of Aden, and then that affects the Suez Canal, well, then, of course, that's going to bring in Egypt, a non-major NATO ally, and, of course, the Europeans are going to have to be more active in that regard. So you suddenly expand the entire theatre of potential military operations and conflict or spillover effect. I mean, I even made a video a few days back talking about how this could bring in Africa, because the Houthis have been working very closely with Al-Shabaab in recent months. There was a notable UN report that was talking about how much they've been working together in interoperability, information sharing, and I think that would bring in Turkey as well, because they've got a lot of interest in Mogadishu. So, yeah, I mean, what could Iran do theoretically then? How can it escalate things without going back to what we saw before? Because I don't think either side really wants to.
Yeah, let me give you a little bit of a calculus. I think, from my understanding of the Iranians, is maybe operating in their minds, and that is that in the lead up to this war, Peter, they had very few advocates in the international system, because like they had none. Maybe Russia and China for sure, but not China wasn't going to go to the mat for the Iranians, right? They would go to the political map, but certainly not the military map. And they had you remember the Europeans had used snapback sanctions last September to snap back UN sanctions under the JCPOA. The Iranians had angered much of the international community by backing Russia in the war with Ukraine. So the Iranians were fairly isolated. I think one of the things that the Iranians are probably thinking right now, which they have to manage very carefully, is that they're no longer, that the tide may have shifted a bit towards thinking that Israel and the United States were the disruptors of the international order, and we're putting the entire global community at risk through this, what they would see as a misguided war. And that Iran enjoyed not sympathy at all, but at least an understanding that maybe they were the underdog here. And that if Iran somehow would capitulate, or Iran would completely collapse, that it might increase the appetite of the United States and Israel for further aggression elsewhere. So I think the Iranians, in a way, have to manage the fact so that they don't do something that completely turns off the international community. So, for example, if they would wage a terrorist attack, let's say in the United States or in Europe, which is one form of escalation, they could. If they wanted to vertically escalate, they possibly could do that. That would turn the tide of the American people, to the degree this war is unpopular in the United States. It could turn the tide in Europeans, completely against Iran once again. So I think what the Iranians are going to try to do is, and maybe this blockade will do it, is basically put the I don't want to say the moral burden, but the burden for stability, for the burden of instability on the United States. Because remember, the charge that the Iranians and others and the Gulf Arab states always had was that Iran was the spoiler. Well, I think to some degree, yeah, Iran has been a spoiler, but remember, spoiler relative to whom? It's a relative case. And now you have the largest superpower in the world, with the help of a regional superpower, Israel, basically threatening through its actions, through this war. And I think most people see this as a voluntary, a war of choice, not a war of necessity, basically threatening the international system. And Iran, to some degree, might enjoy at least a scintilla of being the underdog here. And I think the Iranians are going to be careful on how they manage it. Now, back to your question then, within that context of how they manage escalation from here. Yeah, the Houthis, I think, if in fact this blockade is real, and it's like a vice against the Islamic Republic, and there is the threat of some kind of land campaign, the Houthis could, I mean, all the Houthis would have to do is probably mine the Strait, the Red Sea, or threaten shipping, and that might be enough, frankly, So far, we've seen the Houthis activate. They've launched some missiles against Israel, in the last several weeks. They could certainly activate, and I think the attacks on the Gulf Arab states could also escalate. Now, the only way I think Iran will escalate further with the Gulf Arab states is if they see the United States, if they once again see an existential threat, if they think the United States is coming for Tehran, then I think they'll throw what they can at Israel, throw what they can at the Gulf Arab states. But right now, I think what the Iranians are going to calculate is they can find eventually a way back to the Gulf Arab states the day after. So to your question about what can the Iranians do, there's a number of different options they have. But I think, as you indicated, you said that they are, they're masters at kind of controlled escalation, or we call incremental or graduated escalation. I think they're going to be careful on what means they use to counter whatever threat they perceive. But I think they have other options available. I don't think they necessarily want to use them because I think there's a cost to them and a cost of overplaying their hand. But anyway, I put a lot out there, so I'll stop there.
No, I'm just trying to understand the logic. So, if the rest
My
of
logic or the logic of whose logic?
Well, of the situation of the United States, because if the rest of the world is willing to pay a small toll to Iran to keep,
please don't put me in that position.
But like,
sorry, that was the joke.
No, not at all. I just think Iran wants to. There's a desire amongst the rest of the world to stabilize global markets, right, and just try to return to pre-February 28th. So why does the United States, or Trump specifically, feel the need to block all shipping, especially when it's not even dependent on that oil? America, or is this all about making America the provider of energy, especially to Europe and parts of Asia, right, Japan and so on, because it has a net export capacity?
Peter, you insist on putting me into Donald Trump's brain, right? I mean, I think, and I'm saying that facetiously, but also seriously, in the sense that if you think about what happened in Islamabad, which relates obviously to what's happening in the Strait, there was only really one negotiator there on the U.S. side, and that was Donald Trump. J.D. Vance was there. He was symbolic in the sense that he was the vice president of the United States. There's only one negotiator, and that's Donald Trump. The Iranian, and so the actual negotiator was not in the room in Islamabad. I'll get to your question about what the thinking is in a minute. The Iranians had the actual decision makers there. Ghalibaf, to my knowledge, what I've understood, Ghalibaf and Aghashi had the capacity to strike a deal. Donald Trump was not in the room, but he was in the room, and he's the only decision maker. So, and I think the way in which they left the negotiations is very reflective of Donald Trump, which is he will not, at least publicly, show a retreat or a pathway back from maximalist demands. And if he does, he's going to try to change the subject in some way so that isn't first and foremost in the eyes of the American public. And I think he still believes that somehow the Iranians can be pushed to capitulate. So what that means in terms of how he believes, I mean, one thing that I think is important for your viewers and listeners to understand is that any kind of military strategy has to have a theory of change, of how it affects the calculation of the other party, right? And I say a theory because until the other party either does what the theory suggests or doesn't do what the theory suggests, it's just a theory. But most strategy, military strategy, political, has an assumption or theory of change, of how these actions are going to lead to a particular outcome. An outcome, in this case, being decisions by the Islamic Republic. And I don't think there is a theory here. I think I don't think it's a theory. I think there is a belief in Donald Trump that the world works by greater powers imposing their will and lesser powers having to suffer through it. And I think what Iran has shown is that lesser powers also have a say. They have a vote in how even a military campaign, plays out. And I don't think Donald Trump believes that. I think he believes that they haven't pushed hard enough, haven't pushed the Iranians hard enough. Now, could he be right? I mean, I think only a fool would predict an outcome here. And I think that, is there a case where the Islamic Republic could collapse, or the Islamic Republic could, eventually capitulate? Perhaps, but I don't see that as the most likely outcome here. So I think he's pushing up against a string, assuming that there on the other side, there's a threshold. The Iranians have a belief that this has to be the last war they fight with the United States. That this is a war that they either lose completely, or they at least they win by depriving the United States of a win. They win by not losing, right? And so for them, it can be an endless threshold of pain in some ways.
So,
and so I don't know what the theory Donald Trump has in this, but to me, it does not square with the Iran that at least I know.
So when we look at this aggregately, not just in Trump's brain or whatever we're attempting to do.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, we'll step out of Trump's psyche now. But if we look at it in the whole picture, aggregately, in game theory, you have the prisoner's dilemma and why mistrust dominates as it does, right? In this case, both sides fear being cheated. So both default to some kind of defection, i.e. sanctions, threats, or escalation. And so the result is this persistent tension, even when cooperation would benefit both. How do we get out of this downward spiral? If Trump is unwilling, unless it's purely from an operational sense, Trump can't sustain a blockade, so he then has to return to the table. How do we ensure that the prisoner's dilemma results in a more beneficial outcome instead of a worse realistic one of mutual escalation?
Peter, I think a lot of it is signaling. I mean, remember, the Iranians were at the table in the lead up to this war. Twice, actually. They were at the table last June, April till June, when the 12-day war was waged against them, and then this war. And they were in a weakened position at that point. So they were willing to negotiate on the nuclear issue. And basically, for a whole set of reasons, that collapsed and this war was started. I think the foundation of an answer to your question of how do we de-escalate, how do we get out of this situation, rests upon a couple things. One is, I think the Iranians do believe that the only way for them to de-escalate, or for them to agree to a cessation or to a negotiated settlement, is if they have reestablished deterrence. I know you've heard me say that before, but reestablished deterrence. For them, the signal of reestablished deterrence could have been that the United States sent a vice president there. That was a serious signal that the United States understood that it had to do something different. It couldn't just send Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. It had to do something different to signal to the Iranians that this was important to the United States too. So I saw that as a positive signal. Even if J.D. Vance really wasn't a substantive negotiator, perhaps, it was a positive signal to the Iranians, because for the Iranians to pull back, I think they need to believe that if they pull back, that will not be construed as weakness, it'll be construed as flexibility. The Iranians have a history of, when they show flexibility, the United States interpreting that flexibility as weakness. So for them to go down the escalation ladder, or at least they're kind of stuck on an escalation point. They're kind of stuck in suspended animation right now. But for them to go further down and open up the strait and actually negotiate some of the terms, they need to believe that they're coming from a position of at least some relative strength, so that concessions they make are not misinterpreted and just lead to further aggression. And I think they have to believe that they leave this battle having survived and recreated deterrence. So I think what they need is that they need to see from the United States, both on the ground that the signaling is that the United States wants to de-escalate. Now, obviously, instituting a blockade is the exact opposite of that signaling. But if they started to see facts on the ground, de-escalation on the ground, and the signaling publicly and privately, I think that would be a signal that they would then be willing to show some flexibility within their own red lines, but they would show some flexibility. For the United States, we're back to Donald Trump's brain. I don't know what it would take. I think for the United States, it would take an understanding that not necessarily an admission that this war was misguided, but an understanding that there's a lot at stake here for American citizens and for Iranians and for Israelis and for all of our partners and for the global community, that they have to find a way out. Now remember, the United States is a superpower. It can eat some crow here and there, I think, with maybe a bigger man than Donald Trump. It doesn't have to admit defeat. It would just, the United States could certainly, if Iran, for example, said, okay, we want you to acknowledge we have the right to enrich, but we're not going to enrich for the next few years. But they retain, if the United States would do that, I mean, Donald Trump could claim that he ended this war in a better position in terms of the nuclear issues than before. If in fact, Iran, if there was, Iran, he could certainly claim that Iran's military capacity has already been disabled. They don't need a deal on the missile program, I don't think, because the missile program has been compromised. And Iran's not going to give on that because that's their deterrence eventually. So I think there are ways, but it requires a full understanding of the other. It requires a full understanding of what makes Iran tick at this moment in order to find that pathway. And it's not clear to me that we have that.
No,
I think the Iranians have a better sense of us than we have of them, frankly. I think they can miscalculate vis-a-vis us, but I think they're better equipped than we are at this point. That's a sorry thing for me to say.
Well, I'd say two things to that. Firstly, this sounds more like brinkmanship, or what people might know as the game of chicken, right? Another game theory sort of idea, but each one doesn't want to back down, so their escalation is used as effectively leverage. But too much escalation risks absolute chaos. Yeah. The other thing, though, what I note in all of this always is that we're talking about Iran as a collective, right? There's more than one decision maker, stakeholder, whilst in the United States sense, it's one decision maker, even though it's meant to be a system of checks and balances. It's all just about what Donald Trump thinks, regardless of whether Kushner or Witkoff or even Vance have suggestions. So how much do you think that that's an Achilles heel to the United States, that it is so lopsided like that? The Iranians seem like a rather united front at this point, maybe not between the people and the government, but at least in the government system.
There's a wonderful book out there. I think it's called Masters and Commanders, and it goes back to the Second World War, and it compares what you're talking about. It looks at Adolf Hitler in particular as a single decision maker, basically, right? And compares that strategically with the United States and Great Britain, where it's a much messier process within the United States, the interagency process in the United States, the civil military relations in the United States, and then the relationship between Great Britain and the United States itself. How very, very messy process. And the question the book gets at is which one is strategically more sound? Is it the single decision maker that can operate on a dime? And what the conclusion of the book was that while Germany certainly could turn on a dime, and it did turn on a dime often, because the reins of power and the decision making was in the hands of one flawed individual, there was major miscalculation. And while the United States and Great Britain was a much more of a ponderous process, much more slower moving process, much messier process, that it also was more strategically, the decisions they made when they made them was more strategically sound. And I'm not trying to compare, obviously, I'm not comparing the two cases necessarily. All I'm saying is that the fact that Donald Trump uses what we used to call the 10,000 mile screwdriver, where he has his negotiators in Islamabad, but he's basically turning the screwdriver, and he's making all the decisions, and there's no real counsel. I think we've seen both in the lead up to this war and during the war itself that it has led to significant miscalculation. Not necessarily military miscalculation, but the fact that there was no clear military objective. Now, on the Iranian side, as you indicated, the Iranian side is a bit more complex. They have become unified. It's much more IRGC. They're not IRGC-centered government, securitized government. They're speaking with one voice, but they are bringing various voices within the system, different sets of voices than would have come to the fore if the war had not happened, but still different strategic voices into the conversation and advisors into the conversation. And it leads to some complexity, but we'll see. We'll see how we end up with this war, whether they're messier, perhaps more challenged process
Well, on
because the
that point,
regime.
Ross, where do you think this goes? Just to take us, to our final question of looking forward, what comes next? Are we going to see a return to what we had in all of March? Is it going to be a more reduced level, focused more specifically on the Strait of Hormuz, or will talks actually prevail because of backdoor diplomacy and what we started the conversation at?
I go back to the Yogi Berra quote and Niels Bohr quote, basically saying that how difficult prediction is, particularly about the future. um, Peter, I mean, I don't know. Let me tell you what I do know. I mean, if I gave you a precise scenario of where it goes from here,
That's what I'm after.
you probably should never invite me back again. You probably shouldn't have invited me to the first place. But let me tell you what I do know. I do believe that there are three major parties in this conflict: Israel, the United States, and Iran. I do believe somewhere within the Islamic Republic, in the strategic thinking Islamic Republic, they want this war to end on their terms, not at any cost, but they want the war to end. I have to believe that at the end of the day, Donald Trump wants this war to end. And I think some of the bluster we saw and the frustration we saw was it wasn't ending as quickly as he wanted it to, so he went off the rails, so to speak. I think there is the will. The problem here is twofold. One is I don't think Israel is in the same space as we are here. I don't think they want the war to end. I think they want the war to end on different terms. And so the question is, what role, if we're trying to do a scenario projection, we have to sort of know to what degree Donald Trump is willing to sit on the Israelis and pressure the Israelis. The blockade indicates that he's moving the other direction. He's moving, sort of in a direction of escalation, not de-escalation. If he wants to de-escalate, he's going to have to sit on the Israelis in Lebanon and so forth. And I think it depends upon the ability, because of how complex the issues are, the actual ability to work through these issues. I mean, elections have consequences. We elected a man like Donald Trump. And this kind of a conflict requires an unbelievably focused attention on the part of a leader and focused attention on the part of the bureaucracy that serves that leader in order to translate that desire to extricate from a conflict, which I started out by saying, I think I know that Israel does not want the conflict to end right now, but Iran and the United States do. They do. But it requires the kind of calibrated decision-making and deliberative process in order to get us there. And that's my fear, is despite the will to get out of this conflict, it's going to escalate further and become one of the follies of the 21st century, frankly. We've seen previous follies in the 20th century, the 19th century, going back in history. That's my fear. My nightmare scenario is, despite the desire to de-escalate, we won't have the capacity. And that's frankly because of the limitation, the human limitation of one man to some degree, Donald Trump, and also the fact that the institutions that made presidents smarter than they were, those institutions have been degraded themselves. And so that's the nightmare scenario, is despite the desire to de-escalate, it further escalates. So we'll see. I'm not going to make a prediction because it could go either way.
Well, that's just what we'll have to bring you back on to debate in the next few days as this merry-go-round circus continues. But Ross Harrison, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you back on the program. Everyone watching, do check out Ross's work and his recent book that he's published as well, which will be in the description when this video is uploaded as a pre-recorded version. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes, because we've got another guest to discuss the Hungarian elections, which is very important for the future of Europe. And then we'll be back later on as well to maybe Trump will have re-entered the talks in the time that we are live again with Larry Johnson at 10 o'clock British time. But we'll see you soon. Thanks very much for watching.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for your listeners.